This is the most fucked up thing in this script. Alright everyone, hello and welcome to the Screenplay Archaeology podcast. I'm your host KiramidHead, and in today's solo episode, because I've decided I'm going to try and get one solo episode out a month along with a group episode if I can, I am going to be looking at one I just picked out of my pile at random because it seemed like it would be interesting and weird to talk about, and oh boy is it. It's a script for a contemporary by 1989 standards, because it's dated September 1989, reimagining of Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, which is just called The House of Usher and takes as much inspiration, or at least a little bit of inspiration, from the Roger Corman film adaptation from 1960. And we'll go into that as we go along. And it's written by Jonathan Gems, and it was meant to be directed by Tim Burton, and he has like a little story credit on the cover page, the title page. And so I figured this would be interesting to talk about. But before I get into the script, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping as usual. I wanted to give a shout out, as I've been doing, to the Shelved Film podcast, because they covered the same material that I do, and they do a pretty good job. They got a back catalog of including some scripts I haven't yet covered, some of which I'm going to get to eventually, some sooner than later actually, because I got one coming out this year. But give them a look. I'm going to put a link to their channel, or maybe wherever else you can find them, down below. Check out my social media pages. That'll be linked below to Facebook, Tumblr, and Twitter, and the blog spot if I remember to put this episode on there, as well as my RSS feed, which I don't think is linked below, but you can get it. I forget how I linked that, but I forgot if I've linked that or not. So there's that, and an additional thing I'm going to do, which I meant to do in the anniversary episode, the Alien 3 one, but that one took forever to get recorded, and so I forgot about this, is I actually got a review on iTunes from Christopher Rance, who rated the show 5 stars and said, "I love this show, keep up the fantastic work." He did this on January 1st of this year, and I completely forgot, because I hardly ever look at my iTunes page because it takes forever to get to it, because Podcast Connect on iTunes is not the most helpful thing in the world. It doesn't give you a whole lot of meaningful statistics or anything. Unless I'm doing it wrong, I can never get anything useful out of that. Sometimes I'll check and I saw this months later and I'm like, oh, okay, I'll read it off in the anniversary episode. And then that took forever to get finished, so I forgot about it. But I'm reading it off now, and thanks for the review. It's always cool to see some support for the show. If you have any comments or anything, you can leave them on the iTunes page. We are on iTunes and we are on Stitcher Radio. Check us out on either of those sites and leave a review if you feel so inclined, and I will read it out on the show like I'm doing now. So it might take me a little while, but I will get around to it. So to get into the actual episode, the script, like I said before, is The House of Usher by Jonathan Gems, from an idea by Tim Burton. Well, it says, from an idea by Tim Burton, derived from the story by Edgar Allan Poe. Now, this is dated September 1989, so it would have been fairly soon after Batman, so Tim Burton was kind of around his creative peak at this point. It kind of went from Beetlejuice to, I guess, Ed Wood, maybe a little bit later. He didn't really start declining until the 2000s, but still did some pretty good films in after that and during that period. The last film of his I really liked all that much was Sweeney Todd, and that was a while ago, but that's long after what's generally considered Tim Burton's heyday, and I think that's actually a pretty damn good film, even if some of the people in it aren't, professional singers or anything, and Helena Bonham Carter should just stop the damn squeaking. But it's an interesting movie, and his last great movie I'd say was Big Fish, and before that, even after the Oscar win for Ed Wood, I'd still say the last movie of his I really, really enjoyed from the 90s was Sleepy Hollow. But the one film he worked with Jonathan Gems on that actually got produced was Mars Attacks. Gems wrote that, and there was a rewrite by the by the writers of Ed Wood, but Jonathan Gems came back and rewrote their stuff, so that's why he mainly got credit for it. And I like Mars Attacks. It's a little bit uneven, and there's some things in it that don't quite work, some jokes that don't quite land, some effects that haven't aged particularly gracefully, but it's a fun film, and it is just bizarre in its mean-spiritedness, and I actually kind of enjoy it for that. They did work on some other unproduced stuff together, including The Hawkline Monster, a cowboy monster movie that does star Clint Eastwood and Jack Nicholson, which sounded like could have been cool, but I read a plot summary of the book it was based on Wikipedia, and it didn't. It kind of went in a direction I thought was kind of silly. And he also did Go Baby Go, a beach movie in the style of Russ Meyer. I don't know if I want to see Tim Burton doing that kind of movie. I think that would come off just a little too creepy and not in a good way. And he also wrote an unproduced Beetlejuice sequel titled Beetlejuice Goes Hawaiian. And I have that script. I have not read it because I have two Beetlejuice sequel scripts, and one was by Warren Scarron and was written in 1990. And then Beetlejuice Goes Hawaiian would have been around 96. And most people probably know about that one from Kevin Smith talking about Superman Lives. Like when he first got onto that project, it was because they were showing him these different scripts, one of which was Beetlejuice Goes Hawaiian. And I'm sure it's ridiculous. I've heard that it's not that great, but it just sounds ridiculous enough to be entertaining. Now, as for the House of Usher, so apparently, Jonathan Gems and Tim Burton, they kind of met because Gems did uncredited rewrite work on Batman. Now, researching this was the first time I had ever heard about that, because I've never seen word one about him working on that until I was looking into this script. But he listed it, he wrote a column on British film and he listed it under his byline, so I'm guessing he did legitimately do work, but I've never seen a draft of his name on it, and I couldn't tell you what exactly he did on that. Like maybe it was like a dialogue polish or something, or it was maybe, scaling things back it might have been like production on set rewrites, which normally don't get credited. So, I mean, I have no reason to doubt that he did it, but it's a little strange that I just don't know what exactly he did on it, so I'd be curious to find out. Now, the basic summary of it is that it's set in then contemporary 1989 Los Angeles, and we got this guy called Sam, who's a bit of an introvert and socially awkward, doesn't have much luck with girls. He works at this shop with his friend Ford, and they rebuild classic cars for people. And one day they're at a restaurant, and he falls head over heels for this waitress named Leona, who's always having fainting spells. And her name is Leona Usher, and she has a brother named Bob, and they live in this weird, like, one-story suburban house near the airport in Burrville, which I believe is meant to be a not-so-subtle jab at Burbank in California, which has a major airport near it. And they have this, and he's just this weird guy, and she's all eccentric, and he's even more eccentric, and he has this weird condition where, like, sound bothers him, and he doesn't like the fact that she's seeing a guy. And so he eventually, confines her to the house, and so it ends up being, Sam having to go and figure out what's going on. And it just gets weirder from there, including all sorts of weird shit involving the family, the weirdness that is Bob Usher. The airport ends up being significant. They have a neighbor named Mel, who's this crazy Vietnam vet, whom I swear is in this script for no discernible reason except for plot convenience near the end. But yeah, so it's this weird thing, and you've got Sam's friends who come in and out of it eventually. It's a very thin plot. It's a strange love story that mainly seems to be a vehicle for any sort of weird visual stuff Tim Burton would want to do, and less of a plot. In fact, it goes for this weird kind of gothic suburban thing, which it reads very strange and off-putting on the page here, and Burton would later make better use of it in Edward Scissorhands, which came out, I think that's a 1990 movie, if I'm not mistaken. So that would have been not terribly long after this. So maybe it was just one of those ideas that was percolating in Burton's head that got kind of injected into this script. Now, as far as the Edgar Allan Poe story goes, it's a pretty good atmospheric story. Not a whole lot to it, but it has a nice little punch to it and is definitely memorable. I rewatched the Roger Corman film adaptation recently, which just takes a handful of notes from, and it's not my favorite of the Roger Corman Poe adaptations. That would either be Pit and the Pendulum or Mask of the Red Death, but it's a pretty solid atmospheric film with some good performances in it. Vincent Price is great. The whole movie looks really good and is directed pretty well. And you don't really notice the fact that it only has like 4 actors in the whole movie until like, oh, really? This had that small of a cast. You get to the end, and it's like, wow, this was a limited kind of ensemble, but it works pretty well for the movie. Mark Damon is a little out of place as the male lead, which some of those other movies had. I mean, I think it was John Carr in Pit and the Pendulum was a little out of place in that movie. Jack Nicholson, as much as I love him, is kind of out of place in those movies that he shows up in. But it's a pretty good movie. It was a pretty good story, considering it was like the first like somewhat higher budgeted movie Corman did. And instead of just producing 2 cheap films, he got to do 1 film for the combined cost of the 2 cheap films. And I thought he did a pretty good job, all things considered. And it did have some memorable imagery and some creepy moments in, and Vincent Price is amazing as he usually is. And like the portrait gallery of the family, way weirder and more surreal than I had remembered. I love those paintings and stuff. That stuff's all very cool. But so this version, okay, so it starts, we're in LA, and we meet Sam and Ford. They live there and they fix up classic cars. And I'm only going to mention this part because it comes back later for a completely pointless complication. Ford's like, oh, hey, my friend Mitzi, she went to talk to like her brother in Tokyo, who like has pull over there, and she can get us this deal fixing up cars for Japanese people. And Sam's like, okay. And so he's working on this pickup truck, and they say he's good with mechanics, but he's socially awkward and he has trouble with girls. And this is all written in the scene description. You would get this idea from some of the things some of the dialogue later and some of the character interactions, but the script just insists on being upfront about it immediately. It feels very tell, don't show. And there's this thing where like crows are watching him, and crows are built up to be very important, and unless I missed it, they have no point in this script whatsoever. But so they go home to watch a baseball game, and they're sitting around eating Doritos and drinking beer. It's weird that they specify Doritos, and then Ford's girlfriend comes over and she's like, Sam, I want you to try and ask my friend Ingrid out. And he goes like, she's kind of shallow. I don't know if I like her. And then she needles him about his previous girlfriend, who she says ended up walking down Sunset Boulevard naked with $50 bills taped to her face. And it just cuts to a random flashback to this in the middle of the scene. I'm like, wait a minute, what? So I have no idea what that's about. And so Ford and Sam, they go out, and Ford's like, I gotta find Cindy a birthday gift. He's like, what is she like? It's like, sex and movies. And there's actually a moment where he says maybe a ring. He's like, I'm not getting married. And so they buy her a book called Sex in the Movies. And so they stop to eat at Bob's Big Boy, which for some reason they have to point out the fact that they're eating at a Big Boy. And for those of you who only know Big Boy through Austin Powers, that used to be a real restaurant. It actually still exists in some places, but I've not been in one since the 90s at least, since I was very, very young. I think it was in Tennessee at the time too. Would it have been Chattanooga? I honestly cannot remember. That was a long road trip we were on, and we went to a bunch of places. That's a weird thing. And so their waitress, Leona, Sam sees her, is immediately smitten with her. And then a crow lands outside the window and looks at her, and she passes out. And she apparently has a history of this because her coworker is fine with it. And as Sam's helping her and she wakes up, she says she's not discouraged. And so she's just this weird, quirky, is gonna face everything with a smile on her face. And this character, she's so eccentric in really annoying ways. And I could just see Tim Burton casting Winona Ryder in this part now. She might have been able to pull it off, but at the same time, the way this is written, this could easily still have been annoying. Like, a lot of this script would have lived or died based on the acting and the direction, and you'll see as I go on. And so Ford encourages Sam, who then calls up the diner to ask her out. And so she doesn't understand what he's saying, and she passes it off to a coworker who says he wants to ask you out. She goes like, but I'm already out. And so they go out together, and they're talking, and she says maybe we go to the movies sometimes. She goes like, I've never seen a movie. We used to have a TV when I was a kid, but my brother threw it out when our parents died. And it's like, I was always scared of that TV. And that's never explained. And, it's her brother Bob, who we'll meet in a bit. Apparently, she had a bad case of anemia, which means she never went to school, and that Bob nursed her back to health from. And I'm like, would you really be able to miss school based on anemia? Now, I know this is set in 89, and so she's like 20 in this. And so she would have been in school in like the early 70s. Was school that different in the early 70s that you could skip it based on anemia? Unless unless really bad anemia means you can't do shit, but apparently she's fine now and can leave the house and stuff, so I don't know what. And so they go to an art gallery, and it's pointed out that the art they're looking at is really hideous, but Sam's like, do you like it? And this is like this weird, goofy moment. And so they go and have lunch and they do all this other stuff. They drives her home to her house in Burville. Like I said, a not so subtle sort of jab at Burbank. And there's like a crack by the front door. They call this house the House of Usher. It's this one-story suburban house, which gets weirder and weirder as this thing goes on. Bob's watching from inside, and he's not happy about it. He sees Sam kiss her hand, and he's not happy about it. And then once again decides to tell and not show and says, okay, Bob, he's in his late 30s, and even though he's haggard and kind of thin, he would maybe be considered attractive. And he also has a sexual magnetism about him, which, once again, we're telling and not showing. And also, this never, ever has a point any time in this script. It's like, why are we talking about some dude's sexual magnetism that never comes into play? The script is just, yeah, you can see I'm going after some of the things this does pretty hard. You'll see why when we get to the end, when you see how little any of this has to do with. And so, after working at the shop some more, I think it's like the next day, Sam goes to pick up Leona from her house, which they insist on calling the House of Usher. Bob is once again watching, upset, and then we see him put on earmuffs, and then like the camera pans out, and it gives this reveal that the house is near an airport. And so that fucks with Bob's sense of hearing, which we're not actually told about for quite a while, that he has like this hearing sensitivity. It's actually quite strange. And so Bob, we're told at this point he's an agoraphobe, once again with very little sort of actual explanation in terms of like dialogue and action. Like it just throws that out there. And so he goes to the house of the Vietnam veteran neighbor Mel to try and borrow his car. And we get this thing where the dog starts barking and Mel kicks the dog, which leads to something really fucked up later on. And Mel says, hey, you can borrow the car, but his phobia overcomes him, so he doesn't follow them. And so they have a successful night out, and this is where they really start to fall in love. Bob, he's at home, he's sitting in like a candlelit room plucking on a banjo. And Leona's like, I think I'm in love. And it's like, if only things were that simple, then everybody would die in cemeteries. And I'm like, what are you talking about? The characters in this, the characters in this are all just needlessly strange. Leona says, it's all so simple. What is life, love? If life were simple, we'd all die in cemeteries. Like, what does that mean? Like, I don't understand a whole lot of what any of this is meant to signify in this script. It's so weird. All right, so Sam, he's working. He's working at the shop, and Sam like, I don't know if I. And Ford kind of get suspicious, and then Cindy is like, hey, you have to make your birthday party, which I think is meant to be that night. The passage of time in this script gets really wonky from this point forward. And I think we're nearly halfway through even. No, we're only about 30 pages through. I could be wrong, but very little happens in the first half of this script. But yeah, 30 pages happen and barely anything has gone on. But okay, it's like, oh, you have to make the party that night, but he's going to be make the party. He's like, tonight we're going to be taking Leona to the movies. Okay, I think what's going on in this conversation, even though it's kind of confusing, is that she asks him out to go somewhere. He says, no, I'm taking Leona to the movies. But then she says, hey, you at least have to make my birthday party. I think that's what's going on. But once again, dialogue's a little muddled. So maybe the birthday's on another night. And that's why the passage of time seemed so weird to me. I actually read through this script in 2 sittings last night. So I might have missed some details, but it read pretty quick. And so Leona has a fainting spell at work while this is going on and is taken home by Mel. And he's talking about how great a brother Bob is and how he wish he had a brother just like him. So yeah, this starts with Mel's weird fascination with Bob, which leads to a really fucked up moment later on. And Mel in this is sort of taking the place because in the Roger Corman film, there's a manservant in the house who is there to sort of, give dialogue in certain scenes, and he lets loose an important bit of information later on that pushes the plot forward about Madeline Usher having had catalepsy, which leads to the premature burial thing in the movie. And so he kind of fills that role later on, but it's a little weird. And so Sam goes to pick Leona up at the diner. We don't actually see what happens there, but he's apparently directed to her house, and so he goes there. Mel greets him, and after a little prodding, Sam is like, okay, let me in. And so Mel says, you have to take your shoes off, as Bob is sensitive to sound. Sam meets with Bob in the living room. It's described as being 60s suburban in style, but there's like a taxidermy bird on one of the tables, and there's all these oil paintings around, and one of them looks like Leona, and one of them looks like Bob. So it's supposed to be the Usher family portraits, which were lifted from the 1960 movie. And then Bob is like, Leona's insane. She's not fit to socialize. And I believe it's at this point, I don't think he tells him about the hallucination, but he goes and grabs a box off the shelf, which is kind of from that movie as well. And he shoos Sam out of the house. But Sam leaves his phone number on a note, which doesn't really connect to anything later on. And so Sam leaves, and Mel watches him from the hedges next door. And then we see Bob head to Leona's room, which he keeps locked. And she's in the midst of hallucinating that she's been buried alive, and Bob injects her with something. And so sometime later, Sam returns, and for some reason, it's really over dramatic with like he's driving up and there's like a cemetery near the house and like horror music is playing while he's driving to the house, and it's like, this is not the first time we've seen the house. Like, why are we giving the dramatic build up to it now? Apparently and this is why I say the time frame is wonky, because it's not exactly explained how long it's been since he was last there, and he's left some notes under the doors and whatnot. And so he goes around the side of the house, and Mel knocks him out with a blow to the head, thinking he's a prowler, which I'm not sure if he actually does or if that's his cover later on. It's not terribly clear. And so he wakes up at like the kitchen table, and Bob and Mel are eating lettuce soup. And then Sam hallucinates that crack on the ceiling is some kind of face, which there's a couple of moments where Sam sees things and thinks they're alive, but maybe they aren't. There's one more time when it happens later on, and I'm not terribly clear what that's meant to signify in this script. Like, the script's kind of a mess. And so later on, Sam is speaking to Bob in like this art studio, which is like an addition built onto the house, which for some reason has a door resembling a gothic dungeon. And it's this weird art studio. It's also full of books. And Bob talks about how he carves sculptures from vegetables. Once again, weirdness. And then he says he does it because they're beautiful for a very short time and then they eventually rot. And that's almost a flash of brilliance here, because that's very much a very Edgar Allan Poe-like thing, like this obsession with like the fleetingness of life and beauty is kind of Edgar Allan Poe-ish, but it's such a weird way to throw that in there. Once again, it feels like it's just setting up this weird visual for later on. And he says he composes operas no one will hear because he hates the modern world and he believes he was a troubadour in his past life. Now, there was a moment for an interesting character beat here, because you have Sam, a guy who for a living fixes up classic cars, like old cars, so he has sort of a connection to an older world. And then you have Bob, who has a connection to an older world, and he hates all forms of modernity. They could have connected on something here instead of just being hero and antagonist, but no, that doesn't happen. And so he tells Sam about Leona's premature burial hallucinations, and she dreams about being eaten by crows, and so he shows them the portraits of their family line, how they're all criminally insane, and that's a scene which is lifted from the 60s movie, only here it's almost played for dark comedy, which is strange. Like, he's saying all kinds of weird things about them. Like, I don't understand this script. Like, it is just so weird. Like, he's going on and on about them. He's like, you intensify her malady. Do you know who this is? He's like, should I? This is my great-grandfather, Jeffrey Usher, otherwise known as Buffalo Jeffrey, also known by his tribe as Chief Many Talents. He was a cannibal. And it's like, this is his wife, Mary Louise. She was also known as Malcolm, a schizophrenic. Am I getting through to you? So go to the next portrait. It's an aristocratic woman with white hair and pearls holding up a large sheepdog in her lap. My great-aunt, Ellen Usher, she was a zooarist. Do you know what that is? A zooarist is a person who enjoys sexual relations with animals. I pictured her here with her favorite sheepdog, Woofy, so he painted the pictures. This is George, my grandfather. He was the first judge in Burville. He was also a sadist who believed he was from the planet Neptune. This is his wife, Elizabeth, my grandmother, a sweet woman but a pyromaniac. She burned down many houses in the neighborhood, but nothing could be done because she was the judge's wife. Here's Dad, taxidermist, fur fetishist, alcoholic, and amateur boxer. I was glad when he died. And then he just goes, Mom. And they both expired as the result of an automobile accident. And so he's like, yeah, Leona is tinged with insanity. Do you know what I'm getting at with this scene? Like, in the original, it was meant to be an ominous, when I say original, I mean the original movie. It's meant to be this ominous thing where it explains why Roderick Usher believes his family needs to die out and why he's against his sister being with anybody in that version, because he doesn't want the Usher line to continue because they're all fucked in the head. But here it almost feels like it's only in the script because it was in that movie and it's played for laughs. Like, oh, this woman fucked her sheepdog. This guy was a cannibal from an Indian tribe and he was named Many Talents, blah, blah, blah. It's all so strange. And he just goes, and mom, which was weird. It just feels like it's spoofing that scene from the 1960 movie, and I don't, because it doesn't really play into anything. Like, it almost feels like he has a completely different motivation for wanting his family to die later on. It's very strange. And also during this scene, Malcolm comes over and borrows a book on veterinary surgery, once again building up that fucked up moment. And so Sam is told never to return and to stop leaving notes for Leona. And so Sam, I'm guessing it's later that night, is attending Cindy's party, and Sam tells Ford he has to leave and writes down the address of the house in case he goes missing and misses the meeting with those Japanese guys that is going to happen like sometime. I'm not real sure when. The time frame once again is very weird. And so Ford's like, hey man, you're missing work all the time. I don't like this relationship. And if you miss this meeting, I'm going to dissolve the partnership and you're out. And it's very strange that this plot thread is introduced like 60, 70 pages into this script. Like, we're well over halfway through at this point. And they're throwing this out there that his business is in danger. And I'm like, you're the one who encouraged him to call the girl in the first place. I really don't get what you're getting at. And like, wouldn't this have been brought up before if his relationship had been so bad? Like, it showed that the three friends were concerned. Well, the two friends, it was Ford, Cindy, and Cindy's friend Ingrid who showed up for a scene. She's just this weird Swedish girl. Okay, so Sam, he drives out to the House of Usher, but he decides not to knock on the door because it's late at night, so he sleeps in the car until morning, bursts into the house when the doctor visits. He's this old guy with thick glasses, and he shouts at Bob and like takes advantage of his hearing issue until he points away to Leona's room, and he won't unlock it, and then he goes, oh, you can't have carnal relations because it'll make her heart burst. Then he goes on and on and on about how she's his only reason to live and will kill himself when she dies. And then he mentions like weird things about their parents, like Leona loved the garden, and then the mother paved over and she was upset, but Bob didn't care because it means he didn't have to hose it. And then the father bricked up Bob's window and then complained about it being dark in there. So you get the idea that maybe the parents were abusive. And while he's rattling all these instances off, Sam keeps saying, hey, maybe you should get therapy. Maybe you should get therapy. And there's this irritating conversation that goes on forever. And then Sam imagines for a moment that Leona's portrait is crying, and that's the other moment of the house being alive, which, from Sam's perspective, which we get one from Bob's perspective later on, which makes sense because the guy's nuts. That moment there is just odd. Like, why is Sam imagining that the house is alive when the house being alive never really is a thing, except in Bob's hallucinations later on? Very weird. And okay, this is the most fucked up thing in this script, right? Well, it gets kind of fucked up later on, but Mel comes over and there's this running thing where Mel's dog barks and it bothers Bob's hearing. And Mel says like, and so Mel loves Bob, so he decided to take care of it. So that book about veterinary surgery, he used it to remove his dog's vocal cords. So now the dog tries to bark and doesn't make any noise. That is so... I can't believe they threw it in here and just let it sit. And that Sam, who's supposed to be the sane man in this situation, doesn't say a word. Why is that here? And the whole thing with Mel being a Vietnam veteran also doesn't really play into anything. Okay, so a crow flies to the window and Mel gets a shotgun and starts chasing around outside the house trying to kill it, like it's that scene in the fucking Burbs with Rick Dukeman trying to shoot a bird. Art's got a gun, only it's much better in that movie. And so Leona, apparently she is woken up and she comes out through the French windows going, ooh, what's the racket? So apparently he locked her in her room but didn't bother to board up the fucking French windows on the outside. I don't get what the hell is going on in this. But so Mel shoots the crow, which falls and lands in her hair, and then it wakes up and is all tangled. And then Mel tries to shoot again. Well, also her and Sam go to embrace, but Mel tries to shoot the crow when it's right next to her. And she faints and falls out, knocks herself out, something. And Bob's like, what the fuck? Well, you almost shot my sister. And so Leona comes to in her room and she asks to be left alone with Sam. Bob reluctantly leaves, and so she has Sam read poetry to her. And then Bob walks down the hallway to his own room, and like the walls are like alive and bulging. And he goes into his room and there's photos of his parents, and a vision of them appears before him, and they're begging him to commit suicide and join them. So here we're given so apparently the whole thing about the family being mad doesn't really mean anything. It's really him hallucinating his parents, which is why he wants to die, but he won't die until his sister dies. Trying to make sense of this character is just anger-inducing. And so he climbs up onto the roof of his house, onto the roof of the added-on art studio, which for some reason has a water tank on top of it. Once again, just Tim Burton's weird visuals. And so he goes to jump off, but he can't bring himself to do it. And so the next morning, so Sam slept there overnight, so I guess the meeting wasn't that soon. Leona shows Sam a secret tunnel in the basement that they dug as children, and there's the posts have been carved by Bob into some kind of art. And she leads him to a hidden garden near the cemetery, and he's encouraging her to leave with him and visit Las Vegas. And I think they have sex in this scene, but it's a little vague. But then he notices he has to make the meeting. And while this is going on, Mel mentions to Bob that he refused to kill women and children in Vietnam, but I'm not really sure if he's lying or not, because he says he was ordered to shoot and he shot, but he specifically shot over their heads. But the way he says it and the way Bob reacts, it almost seems like he's maybe lying or trying to make himself appear better than he was. I'm not real clear on that part. And so Sam, he rushes off to the meeting, which goes pretty well. So that whole plot thread was brought up and resolved in the space of about 15 pages. And then Sam returns only to find that Leona has been declared dead in his absence by the doctor. Then Bob blames Sam for not leaving her alone. So the whole meeting thing is just a contrivance to get Sam away from Leona just long enough so that this death thing can happen. And of course, she's not actually dead because it's fall the House of Usher. Usher's sister gets put in the tomb alive. That's how the story goes. And so the funeral is held and Leona is interred in a crypt. And it's attended by Sam, Bob, Mel, the doctor, the funeral director, and his assistant, who just feel like they're there to have weird Tim Burton-y characters in it, even though they don't say anything. And there's an old woman, and Sam's like, did you know Leona? And she's like, no, I just like going to funerals. I'm like, is she funeral crashing? Is she taking advice from Will Ferrell from Wedding Crashers? What the fuck was that? And so after they leave, we hear Leona screaming in the coffin, and we see her pounding on it, but no one's around to hear. And so Sam and Mel talk, and Mel assures him that he's not to blame. He says Leona has always been sick, and he rattles off a list of the illnesses she exhibited, including catalepsy. And there's this stupid moment where Sam goes, wait a minute, catalepsy, what's that? And Mel goes, isn't that when you're afraid of cats? That's really a line in this script. I am not even kidding. But then Bob goes, wait a minute, I think that's when you look dead, but you're not really dead. Oh, wait, the doctor was old and had thick glasses. And I'm like, fuck you, I wear glasses. I would be able to know if a woman was dead or not. The doctor's just an idiot. And so he takes a flashlight, rings the keys, and he goes to confront Bob, and he says he did it on purpose because he's been sexually attracted to his sister for years, but he never did anything because that's not right, but he was still obsessed with her, and he suffered for years because even though he wanted her, it was not right. He wanted to keep her happy, and he wasn't happy about her leaving him, and so he used her greatest fear against him, and against her, and I'm not really sure how. You're not really told what happened in between Sam leaving and coming back that caused him to send her into cataleptic shock. In the 1960 movie, she goes into her room and Roderick confronts her and they're arguing, and I guess you're meant to believe that the shock of it caused her to fall into the trance. And then during the funeral scene with the open coffin, her fingers are twitching, and then Roderick notices and then shuts the coffin before the wannabe boyfriend can notice, and so he deliberately has her interred alive. I'll give this script credit. Going to the incest place, even if they never actually committed incest, is commendable. I like the fact that it went that dark and that disturbing, and it actually has a point in the plot as opposed to the dog thing, which is just why. And it's not it's not too off the wall of attack to take with the fall of the House of Usher, because that's a commonly used interpretation of the story, is that Roderick and Madeline Usher, who are this twin, I believe they're meant to be twins, they're like a brother and sister who live together alone in this house, and they seem to be unnaturally close. There's enough ambiguity in Poe's prose that you could read that into that story. It is a little just kind of thrown in there. Like, I would have liked to have seen this storyline actually developed instead of the half-assed romance. Like, maybe make it all about the brother and sister and have, like, Guy, let's come into it somehow. Like, make it more strongly about that relationship instead of just random weirdness and just odd, weird, like the weird house and weird, almost comedic behavior where you're not really sure how seriously this is meant to be taken. And yeah, I wish it would have, been a little bit more darker, a little bit more serious. And that's the thing, this feels like an Edward Scissorhands take on The Fall of the House of Usher, and that's not the kind of Burton I would have liked. I would have preferred to see Batman Burton or Sleepy Hollow Burton as opposed to Scissorhands Burton on this. Like, I just don't think it's that good of a fit. But so Sam, he gets the keys from Bob, he takes a flashlight, and he goes to the crypt to find the coffin empty and finds that there's a passage behind a wooden door, which I guess is meant to connect to the tunnels that are under the house. And Sam goes down to the tunnels, and Leona, who's now raving mad, and there was blood and scratch marks on the coffin from when she forced her way out, bashes his head against the wall and briefly knocks him out and takes his flashlight, runs down the tunnels and goes looking for Bob. Meanwhile, Ford and Cindy, who are concerned about, also a storm is going on, I should mention, because that's going to be significant in a moment. Ford and Cindy, they decide to drive to Burville to look for Sam, which they end up being completely useless. And so Leona emerges from the trapdoor in the basement. She breaks off the end of a broom handle to use as a weapon, and upstairs Bob is waiting with Mel, who has a bayonet, but no bullets in the gun. And so he misses Leona, and he gets the broom handle through the throat, which somehow does not kill him or make him pass out. And Leona moves in, and she's strangling Bob, and I misspelled plane because it was late at night when I took these notes, and so I wasn't paying strictest attention to spelling. But no, a plane that's landing at the airport, and we've been hearing planes take off and land this whole time and mess with Roderick's condition. It's caught up in the storm, gets struck by lightning, and crashes into the house, and starts making it crumble and burn, and Mel's house gets crushed completely by one of the wings. So it's weird, like the wing just flattens Mel's house, but the body of the plane on the House of Usher just kind of makes it crumble gradually. Like, that's kind of weird and doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and also that's kind of, once again, another over-the-top goofy thing. It can't just be the house collapses or burns. No, because it just rips apart and collapses into the lake in the original story, and in the movie it burns down, because it looks to me in the movie, by the way, they just ran out of money to do like an effect shot of the house ripping apart, because there's this whole build-up about the house being structurally unstable, and at the end it just kind of burns. It makes me think they ran out of effects budget or something. And so it crashes in the house and starts making it crumble, and Mel, who's not dead, goes to get Leona with the bayonet, but then gets knocked out by a piece of debris. Sam emerges from the basement and he pulls Leona away, and Bob gets killed because he's looking around at the burning paintings. Like, some wall crumbles away and he sees the burning passengers in the plane, and their faces for some reason look like the Usher family members. And then he pulls the painting of Leona off the wall, which is on fire, and goes to kiss it, which admittedly is a pretty freaky image considering, the plot twist about the incestuous feelings earlier. And if this were a better written, a more interesting script, this could have been a cool moment. So I'll give it this. There are cool moments and cool ideas sprinkled throughout this thing that are just aren't really used in the best context. And okay, but he's kissing the painting, and then the collapsing house, makes the chandelier fall and impales the painting to his face and then kills him. And so Ford and Cindy, they arrive. They try to get the front door open, but it's being held shut by debris. But then Sam loses his grip on Leona, and she falls through a hole in the floor and into the basement, and Sam goes after her. And the trap door itself is blocked, but somehow there's like a way to get in, which the description didn't really help for me in this case. But there's like a grating, and Sam's having a hard time, but then Mel, who's somehow still alive, helps, push Leona through this grating or whatever it is, and Sam goes through after her. So somehow Mel's still alive, but he gets killed in the crumbling house, and so they go down the tunnels, they emerge from the crypt just as the house and the crypt collapse for good, and it appears that Leona is okay. And that is the end of the script. So, final thoughts? I know there was not a whole lot of analysis as I went along in this thing, but there really wasn't a whole lot to analyze here. It's really just a script where I'm reading it and I'm wondering what the hell every 5 minutes as I go along. The idea of reimagining the fall of the House of Usher in the modern day is an interesting one. It does have merit to it, but I don't think this script is particularly good. Like I said earlier, it just feels like an idea to showcase just the weird stuff Tim Burton wants to do visually. Like, for example, the water tank that's on top of the art studio. Like, there's a moment during the crumbling house where, like, Sam, like, carrying Leona, he, like, drags her into the art studio, and the water tank falls through the ceiling, and then the vegetable art, like, falls into the overheated water and starts cooking the vegetables, and the neighbors are like, smells like vegetable soup. And I'm like, that's just a weird idea that Tim Burton had, I guess, and got thrown in here. Like, the Bob's Big Boy and the classic cars and the airport and, mocking Burbank, making a nod towards Burbank, I guess, and the whole mixing of styles with 60s suburban, and it's mentioned that Leona's bedroom is 60s suburban, and as well as post-war, so I guess 40s, 50s style. But then you have the weird, like, dungeon door to the Gothic art gallery or the art studio, and carving art from vegetables, and treating, the dark family history as a joke, and that has nothing to do with anything because it's really just that Bob is a weird, incestuous, suicidal guy who has visions of his parents, and that's why he wants the family to die off. And the Vietnam veteran thing, which is just there so that we can discuss Vietnam and give a reason why the guy is crazy and have a reason for a bayonet at the end. And the whole dog thing, like, what the fuck is that doing in this script? Sam's whole classic car job, which gets brought up and made a big deal out of like a couple times, has no point. The whole thing about like, oh, Bob got rid of the TV, that has no... Like, the only thing that really has a point that pays off is the idea that Leona has been sick throughout her life. It's just a weird mishmash of random shit, and the fact that he took the fall of the House of Usher and gave it a sappy, romantic, happy ending does not jive for me. Like, that's so un-Po. And the fact that Roger Corman, a dude known for making B-movie schlock, had more balls and more of an edge to his ending than Mr. I Love My Gothic Dark Moody stuff, that's just bizarre, and I don't get it. Like, I really don't get it. Like, Roger Corman, the guy who produced Giant Leeches and Wasp Woman, showed more respect and like love for Poe's source material than the guy who very much loves gothic imagery. It's so like, I don't understand that, and I just hate that ending because, like, I mean, giving the fall of the House of Usher a happy ending after the woman has been buried alive and gone insane is copping out, frankly. It's a cop-out. It's wussing out on having a dark ending, which, I mean, Burton is no stranger to dark endings. I mean, okay, I'll admit I'm not the world's biggest fan of Batman Returns. Like, I will admit it has its cinematic merits, but just the things it does to Batman characters just kind of bug me. But the ending is very gloomy. Like, it's a happy ending, but it's very gloomy and morose in a fashion, which this just isn't. I mean, Edward Scissorhands has a very bittersweet ending to it. I mean, some of the really good Tim Burton movies kind of go to a dark place and have more challenging endings than this does, which just ends up being like just an odd ending and a better version of this kind of weird, not everything connects, but is creepy and stylistic throughout, which works a lot better and also has kind of a paper-thin love story in it, is Waxwork. The Anthony Hickox movie with Zach Galligan. That's a much better idea of that's what this reminds me of the most, this script. It reminds me of that. But that movie is just so odd and just... That movie works, whereas this script just is odd. And maybe it's just on the page, it reads like shit. It could have, if it was directed and acted the right way, it might have been interesting. And I have a feeling if this got made, it would have had a cult following, just because of Burton's visual style, and people generally love his films from that period, from Beetlejuice on to Ed Wood. People generally tend to love those movies specifically, with the turning point generally being Mars Attacks, but that and Sleepy Hollow have a following. Planet of the Apes is generally considered a piece of shit, but and most of his stuff post 2000 isn't really particularly well liked. But I think this would have had a cult following. I mean, I probably wouldn't be part of it, but I think it would. And what this came down to is that eventually at some point in 94, post Ed Wood, Burton was choosing between, or 95, I think he was choosing between what project he would do next. It was either going to be this or the Catwoman spinoff, which had a script by Daniel Waters. And he eventually chose to do neither and did Mars Attacks instead, which was the right choice because having read this, I didn't much care for this script. It was just too weird and random. And I've gotten about 25 pages into that Catwoman script, and it was so bad I had to stop reading. Like, imagine, like, very, very broad satire that thinks it's way more clever than it is. Like, it's trying to be a clever satire of superhero media, while just being really ham-fisted and stupid with terrible jokes. Really terrible, like straw feminism, and just like the superheroes are all fascist assholes and one of them's a pedophile. Like, ooh, like, and just a lot of really terrible humor, like it takes place in Oasisburg. Like, that's a whole episode for another time, and I dread actually having to read that piece of crap from beginning to end. But I honestly can see why you didn't pick one and why this fell by the wayside. Now, Burton was attached or expressed interest in doing another Roger Corman remake at one point, which was X the Man with the X-Ray Eyes. Now, that's a flawed movie, which I'm a fan of that original movie. It's got this really intriguing premise and some cool ideas in it, and one hell of a fucked up ending, which I just adore. And Ray Milland is great in that. Having read this, I have a feeling that depending on who wrote it, I don't think Tim Burton was the right guy, because I think you could do a really cool, modernized remake of that story, with the main reason because the effects in that movie really don't hold up. Like, it's basically just very, vague images with a kaleidoscope in front of them. Like when he's looking at a building, it's like they show a building under construction with a really irritating, hard on the eyes kaleidoscope effect over it. So, and I'm not necessarily saying just CGI. I'm saying just like a general sort of modern kind of thriller approach to that story could really work. But I think Tim Burton, going off of this, Burton, I think, would have played it a little too comedically, and I wouldn't have liked that remake either. Like, I'd like to see the script if that ever pops up. But yeah, so that kind of made me lose interest in the idea of Tim Burton remaking that, because it was intriguing to me when I first heard about it, because I really like that movie. But based on how this went, I'm not real sure. But yeah, House of Usher, it's not a boring read, I'll give it that. And some might find this more interesting than I do. Like, I was never bored reading this. Like, there was always something weird, what the fuck happening every page almost, or just some goofy thing happening. But it's got this weird tone where fucked up things will happen and it'll be surrounded by really goofy shit. But I'm not really sure how goofy it's meant to be. The tone is all over the place. And yeah, I didn't care for this script, and maybe Tim Burton could have saved it with his direction and with the right casting. But I'm still not sold on this. Like, it definitely would have been a cult, would have had a cult following. But yeah, I can't say I'm particularly impressed by it on a script level. So that about sums up this episode. It was a nice, quick solo work. And until the next time, guys, I hope you enjoyed this. Once again, check out my social media pages. Check out the link to the Shelved Film Podcast. And until next time, which should be with a co-host and be tied into well, it's already out in some territories, but it's an upcoming release in this country. Stay tuned, guys.